Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. The papers have been full of debate about the consequences for our human future of the Earth's hugely swelling population. Will it bring yet more extinctions and yet more extreme violence? We will get some historical perspective today with the writer Melanie Challenger, whose poetic meditation about us, other species and dying cultures is called On Extinction. And with the statistically inebriated Matthew White, whose handbook to the most deadly events through history is full of surprises. But we're going to start nearer to home, talking about more fantastical, nostalgic and sometimes violent traits in Englishness. We hope to be joined by the playwright Jez Butterworth, whose Jerusalem is the most lauded new play for years. Unfortunately, he met a 40-foot-high giant while walking down Oxford Street, has been popped into his trouser pocket, and the giant has now made off with Mr. Butterworth. If he drops him out, we will have him on the show very shortly. But we're going to start with Jarvis Cocker, bard of Sheffield, whose songs for pulp and in his solo career, Sardonic Suite, have resonated for decades. Jarvis, the lyrics are now published by Faber as if they were poems, as it were, in a book.
No, you mustn't say that.
Well, they sort of look like poems. You open this book up and it's called Mother, Brother, Lover.
Yeah, even that rhymes.
And even that rhymes.
Yeah.
It's your favourite rhyme, I think you say, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And they look like poems, but you make the point at the beginning that it's very, very important not to confuse a lyric with a poem.
Yeah, otherwise you will be prosecuted. Because these words all came about because I'd written some songs, or I'd written songs as a member of a band, and you know, once you've got a song, it's not really a song until somebody's put the words on it. I was the singer in that band, so that was my job.
You're the singer, you write the words.
Yeah, which at first, when I realised that I'd wanted to be lots of kids want to be in bands, don't they? You know, it's like a fantasy, like I want to be an ambulance driver or a fireman, spaceman. I want to be a singer, pop star, show off, get lots of girls, etc. But then you realise you actually have to do some work, and I was going to have to write the words to the songs, and so then you've got that horrible thing of what am I going to write about?
And a lot of your songs are stories; they're small narratives, which are about your early life in Sheffield, being an adolescent, trying to pick up girls and so on.
Yeah,
and
nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed.
No.
And you say that you were looking as a kid for songs which were more about your real experience rather than sort of glossy, overwritten songs, perhaps that you've been listening to.
Yeah, well, I suppose that's if I've got any originality, which we can discuss if we want in a bit, but that's where it is, because I was a fan of pop music. I've been brought up with pop music. Pop music was central to being a kid, you know, when I was a kid. People
Absolutely.
did watch Top of the Pops, people discussed the bands that they liked, they rooted for the bands who were going up the charts and stuff like that. So I was into all that culture of it, but then for some reason I wanted it to tell me something a bit more than just like, "Ooh, love you, baby, I think you're really good," whatever. So I wanted to put some what I really thought about relationships, because I thought when I first kissed a girl, it wasn't anything like it had been in songs. It was a cataclysm. Well, it weren't. It was all right actually, but it was different to how so I thought, well,
so
let's
you've got all the fumbling and the mischances and the surprises and so on.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because your songs are very specific, but they've worked because people, even if they didn't go to St Martin's College and study sculpture, or even if the girlfriend didn't have wood chip on the wall at her home, they seem to be something that people plug into and said, yes, I had an experience just like that, or that reminds me of so-and-so.
Well, I hope so. I think the thing is, people always overlook the material that they should be writing about, because it's right under the noses, so I suppose they don't see it, you know. It's too obvious to them. Or they think, oh, nobody's going to be interested in that. Everybody knows that. But that's the big mistake, and that's what I'm here today to make sure nobody makes this mistake. No, because it's like that's your material. That's what you should write about. But there's a trouble, you know, with lots of art forms or whatever, but especially in songwriting, that there's a certain subject matter that you should write about. You know, motorbikes, or you know, or certain roads, Route 66, you know, whatever, and it just becomes cliched, and let's wear a leather jacket and all this kind of stuff, and then it dies off, doesn't it? So I want it to be about something that I thought was real and wasn't being represented in some way.
And another source of the real, clearly for you, is the news, what's happening. And these songs these lyrics have got footnotes to them in this book, which is really helpful. So, for instance,
I'm glad you think that.
Well, when you've got you've got a song called "Fat Children," in which is the reference to the police shooting somebody, and that was sparked off by the de Menezes shooting.
Yeah.
This reveals. And so on. So there's quite a few examples like that, aren't there?
Yeah, I was quite surprised when I went and looked back through the words that I knew that I've never kept a diary or anything, so I knew it was the nearest I had to like a diary of my life. But then there were little details like the South Yorkshire Transport Executive's policy of having cheap bus fares for everybody, but then that got squeezed in the mid-'80s. And the bus fares went up after 7. There's a reference to it. My editor at Faber was saying, "What's this about bus fares going up after 7 o'clock?" So I know that's not the most interesting thing. I can see everybody glazing over when I talk about public transport. But I did realise that there was like a bit of a history of what had happened in the country at large of little changes. You know, the National Lottery coming in 1994, and these things that you think they've been there forever. So there is a wider thing. I've never particularly tried to be a topical writer, as in I think your writing has to come from a personal experience. But you know, we live in society, so sometimes you interact with society and have something to say about a wider picture of society. But I don't think you should. If you try and do that, if you try and say, I'm going to nail this. I'm going to say the situation in this country. I'm going to express it in 2 pages. Then you're going to write something terrible.
What's been very interesting in the last 10 years or 20 years or so is that we've had generations of songwriters entering their 40s and sometimes 50s and 60s.
Oh, well, I'm not there yet, but yes, thank you.
But this notion that rock or pop was written is absolutely about teenagers and young adolescents, and it's about that experience. That experience only has been challenged, and people have had to find new things to write about and new ways to write about them because they haven't stopped.
Have they
I'm thinking about Bob Dylan's writing about all sorts of
no, some people have
stuff,
some people
Nick
have.
Cave possibly as well, and we're living through the growing up of a form which started as a young form.
Yeah, and in a way I mourn that. It's horrible, isn't it? It's like, as a person, it's horrible having to grow up in it and have to be responsible and like to be sensible and just 2 glasses of wine an evening and whatever. But you have to do it, otherwise you end up face down in a field.
Yes,
people wean on you or something.
Just don't knock it. I think
right. Well, that voice, I should say, is the voice of Jez Butterworth. Just a few moments ago, while Jarvis Cocker was in full flow, an enormous gnarled giant's hand opened the door and popped him into his seat. So he's here and welcome. Do you relate to what Jarvis was saying, particularly about writing about the specific? To get to the general, you have to nail it down to the specific.
Well, when I read the introduction to your book, I was both thrilled and dismayed to discover that it's identical to my process, and yet I can't write songs. And if I could write songs, I would write songs. I'd much rather write songs than write plays. I'd much rather write poems than plays. There's things I want to be able to do, and I was very surprised to discover that you could take that and it applied directly to the way I approach stuff. I do think, in terms of what's topical and what's not, I haven't really got any interest at all. I think that you write the things that you have to reveal. You've got no choice, really. And you run out of things to write about when you run out of things to reveal. And those things, they will be the furniture and the fabric of your life, because that's unavoidable. But I can't sit down and write you a play about identity cards or, I'm just not interested in the world in that kind of a way. It has to come from a much more personal place.
Is it about, do you, when you're writing, first of all, when you're writing a song, do you from time to time think this is just going to be a sensational one? Did you think when you're writing Common People this is going to be one of those ones that cuts through in a totally different way?
No, because that would be terrible, wouldn't it? Sitting there like toasting yourself.
No, but you don't feel a little kind of frickle of
brilliant.
this is going really, really well.
No? Sometimes you can think something's good, but you always have to have that thing of looking at it in the morning anyway. Sometimes you can think, wow, yeah, that was all right, and then you read it back. And then also, you know, because it is a song, it's really only until you actually sing it to the people who you're in a band with, and if you're embarrassed at singing it in front of them, then you know you haven't, you know, you can think, wow, this is great, but you might find it's really pretentious when you actually sing it in front of other people, and especially when you do it in a concert, and then you can just tell whether people are wanting to go to the bar or actually you know, interested in it. So
I should just say this is a Faber book, and you've joined Faber as an editor. What's all that about? What do you want to do there?
You should ask them what that's all about. I'm excited about, you know, Faber was a publisher that I was very pleased to work with because I like the way they present things in quite a plain way, and I guess they think that I've got something to offer in terms of bringing things to their attention, and I hope to do that. I hope to kind of, you know, say, oh, look at this, consider this, and fight for these things to come out, but I haven't done it yet, so it's a bit hard to actually talk about it.
Melanie, you're a poet, among other things. What do you think about the distinction between a lyric and a poet and a poem?
Well, I mean, I agree with something that Jarvis says in his introduction, that, you know, lyrics have to be seen. That you talk about lyrics as having a natural habitat, you know, that they can't be they have to be understood as part of their music, and at the same time you talk about, but, you know, lyrics are poetical, and I think that's true. There is a crossover, you know. Obviously we see ballads in established 20th century, you know, established collections of poetry, and that's for a good reason, because they have a poetical role, but they need to be understood in their musical life.
Yeah.
Jez, I want to move on to Jez Butterworth. I want to move on to Jerusalem, but before we do, I'm very conscious that an awful lot of people listening, you know, it's got sort of super reviews and it's done very well in New York and London and all the rest of it, but lots of people will not have seen it and not have read it. So can we just kind of very, very briefly talk a little bit about what the play is about?
Sure, yeah. It takes place on St George's Day in a wood outside a fictional village in Wiltshire, and it concerns a traveller or gypsy called Johnny Byron, who has been living in the wood for about 3 decades and has been refusing to move and generally making a mischief of himself and bringing light and heat to the area across the years. And the action begins the day that he's going to be evicted from the wood.
And there's lots of kids who go there for their drugs and go there and drink and so on. So this is a swirl of local people in and around his caravan.
It's got a great atmosphere.
And you said earlier on you don't like writing, you know, you wouldn't take a theme and say, right, I'm going to write about this. But everybody who's seen it talks about the Englishness of it. I just want to start, we were talking about lyrics and so on. You may not write poems, but you write very charged language. I mean, everyone talks these days about the difficulty of finding a sort of a theatrical language which is more charged, more electric than the day-to-day language. And again, it seems to me that you use a lot of specifics in your writing. I mean, people are going to need lots of footnotes one day to this play. What was Benylin when you mixed it with brandy and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of that comes from that attempt to write rhythmically, to write songs, which is what I've always been trying to do and failing to do. In terms of its sort of Englishness, at the very beginning of the process, I wanted to write something that concerned Englishness, but that only produced really bad versions of this play. You know, I did a couple of versions a few years ago that wanted to have things to say about England, and they were appalling. They were just like stuffed birds. They just wouldn't fly. They just wouldn't get off the ground. And it was really only when I realised that it had to just come through me and be something that you revealed that you didn't know what it was saying, that it might stand a chance of standing. And that thing that you said, like, you know, what if you're writing something and you think it's good, it's the worst possible state you could ever enter into, is you start to celebrate your victory before the game's even over. But
and then you forget what you're trying to do.
You forget, you become self-conscious. So the closest I get, and I'm sure you feel the same around the table, the closest you get to feeling something's good is looking at it and thinking, where the hell did that come from?
See, that's something I find really interesting, because both of you talk about the fact that, I mean, you were saying about how your work is revealed, but you also talk about a lot about the fact that you aren't deliberately guiding what's happening. And both of you wrote, I mean, you were saying that you only really got going with great lyrics once you'd left Sheffield, but we're glancing back at it. So it's a kind of nostalgic process. And similarly, you wrote this piece in New York, didn't you? So you were displaced from England at that point in time. So do you think that the displacement helps in terms of what you're able to actually then make use of? And if so, do you think it's like a subconscious that's driving it, or a kind of a nostalgic compulsion driving it?
I suspect that anything that allows you, any device that allows you to get out of your own way as you sit down to try and write something is probably going to help.
Jarvis, would you agree with that?
I agree, and also the thing of your brain kind of offering these things up, because it's probably doing some sifting, saying, can I get rid of this memory now? And open up some space for some new memories, and then you think, oh, actually, no, I'd like to hang on to that. So you write it down,
Apart from the eeriness of Jerusalem coming back onto the London stage just when there is a huge confrontation going on between travellers or gypsies and the local authorities, the council officials, which is odd, it's a play which describes rural England in a much more sort of scuzzy, knocked about, and quasi sort of violent way than the picture book, isn't it? I mean, and that presumably comes from living in Wiltshire.
Well, it comes from living in Wiltshire. It comes from living in Exmoor for the last 5 years, where I've lived. I mean, I think that the countryside is an incredibly vibrant place. I see it. I mean, I think that the version of it that I describe isn't exaggerated in any way at all. If anything, it's toned down. I mean, I think that it's so alive and it's so its own thing. I was so surprised and thrilled to discover just how many different colours it possessed, and also, you know, how different it was to the city, how it contained the same kind of levels of brutality, but just in a very different way.
And yet, this is a countryside where people are really stuck, aren't they? I mean, they can't move. They find it very hard to move forward.
Well, I think if I discovered this afterwards, thank God. But I think if the play's got a theme, it's about change. It's about trying to move on. I think there's characters desperate to move on, and there are characters desperate to stay. Rooster's desperate to stay, but he's got to go. You know, the publican in it, Wesley, is desperate to go and he has to stay, and they're all kind of arranged along that wheel. I'm not sure I even did that on purpose, but yeah, I think that the countryside is perhaps a good setting to examine change, both seasonal and the idea of sort of economic stasis.
And that was something that people were saying was kind of subversive about it. Anyway, the fact that the Royal Court normally does very urban, you know, you get a representation of urban work, and finally there's something that's a bit more marginal, has become marginal, even though it's not marginal, of course.
Yeah, I think I've done 4 plays there now, I think, and 3 of them are set in the countryside.
Yeah.
You know, Jerusalem, the Winterling and the Night Heron all happen in rural settings.
Yeah.
So hopefully I'm keeping the end up for people that don't live in major conurbations.
Mark Rylance, who gives such a fantastic performance as Rooster Byron and the main character, said that he thought the play had succeeded because it was satisfying a hunger in audiences for wildness and defiance. There's a feeling afterwards they've eaten something they haven't eaten for years, something they've forgotten. That's really need for their health.
Sorry.
A kebab coated with ease and whiz or something, I don't know. But that will actually
delicious. I hear they're doing that in good restaurants.
But the wildness is something that you were working hard to bring out, presumably.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it just, a sense of like defiance is always really, you know, it's just really, really important. I mean, just look what's happening outside St Paul's right now. I think it's just absolutely brilliant. Now, bless him, my lovely cab driver who drove me here, he's not having a great time because it's hard to get around town. But, you know, tough luck, because, you know, it's really important. I just don't think you can. It's almost like a check and a balance. People have a sense of when they've been ripped off, when they're getting ripped off, and sooner or later they've had enough.
Would you recognise the sort of, there is a stroppiness about the English which bubbles up? I mean, we seem to have this idea that England has always been a very sort of calm, manicured, well organised country, but actually, if you look at the history of it, there's been it's always been stroppy and difficult, hasn't it, Jarvis?
Yeah, there's a well, it's that thing, you know, it's kind of one of the good things about Britain, but it's also the thing that people hate as well, isn't it? You know, like football hooliganism. There's something in the British psyche which you just have to get hammered to kind of express yourself in some way. There's some kind of deep thing that you kind of have to smash through in some way, and often that involves getting wasted, and then it comes out, and it's not a nice, pretty thing, but it's there. So I guess we have to deal with it in some way. You know?
I think as well, it's that charisma, because I really recognise. I mean, I know about a bit of that area anyway, because I kind of grew up in Newbury and around that kind of. So that was all really familiar to me. But also, you know, I think people who are living authentic lives, and sometimes they're really hard up against it, but they're living their authentic life. They have a charisma, and yeah, it's edgy, and there's edgy stuff about it that actually either you'd rather forget or, you know, on second glance back as a more mature person isn't that good, you know. But at the same time, what they had was they could tell stories, they were exciting, you know, they were vibrant, and they were living a real life.
There's energy to it, but the trouble is it can get burnt out really quick, you know, that's the other side.
And it grows old, doesn't it? Which is a lot of what happens with Rooster.
Which, if you're writing plays rather than try and live it as a life, is dramatic. You know,
Yeah.
it is. It's because it throws up all kinds of ambiguities. You know, it's not something you want to try at home. Or perhaps it is. Yeah.
No.
Are we going to hear more of Rooster Byron, do you think?
In what sense?
Is he going to come back?
In other
You've done a
forms.
Midsummer Night's Dream, so The Winter's Tale with Rooster Byron.
Do you know, I would love to be able to speak in that voice again. And if that happens, it happens. But unfortunately, I have no control over it.
Meanwhile, the BBC would like to make it clear that it is not corporation policy that everybody living in Wiltshire is a drunken, violent drug taker. Let's move on to Melanie Challenger's book on extinction, How We Became Estranged from Nature. Melanie, extinction is something that we read about and talk about the whole time. It's in the press. We are constantly told we're going through the 6th great extinction of species on the planet. And your book begins, and you write very movingly about the blue whale early on, and seeing it in the Natural History Museum, which is an interesting place to see a whale.
Obsession.
But it's a book. Your notion of extinction is as much about the extinction of human cultures as it is about the extinction of animals.
Yeah, I mean, it's the book is an effort on my part to try and understand the world that I've inherited and the world that I live in. And you talk, ambiently we pick up, and now very loudly because it's become mainstream, we know that there is an elevated rate of extinction of wildlife and wild places. But similarly, you also then find out that there's estimates of about 6,900 human languages. About 50% we're sort of saying are likely to disappear for a range of different forces, forced and choice. People choose to do that as well. But it was also smaller stories, you know, just an ambience of loss was something that I wanted to respond to, because it's smaller stories like, you know, the fact that most of our dialects in the UK are levelling out. And, you know, a lot of the ideas, the knowledge, the times that those dialects encoded are disappearing and being forgotten. And it's a change of a period of very sudden and very fast change. We always have change as a normal part of life, but it's a very rapid phase of change and a very wholesale phase of change, and that's unprecedented.
And you felt that to try to write about this, the first thing to do was to travel. So where did you choose to travel? And why?
Choose is kind of, as I said, it's like a really earnest effort to try to understand what's happening. Mm-hmm. And I set out on a somewhat idiosyncratic journey as a result of that. It isn't, you know, I didn't have a formula in advance. I just sort of pursued lines of research. So I was my family lived down in Cornwall now, and I was down with my family there, and surrounded by the tin industry. And I was sort of sat there trying to wade through all of these 19th century books, you know, by Darwin and Lyell and so forth, and looked up, and there were all of these ruins of the tin mines, and I was thinking, these are absolutely beautiful. And not only that, loads of people are just drifting in like wisps of smoke coming to see these things, and yet, you know, they're symbols of, to a certain extent, our destructiveness, and they're, you know, why are we finding them beguiling? So I started to think about what it is in human beings who are arrested, you know, that they find loss and extinction an arresting thing in and of itself. They find ruins fascinating. You know, I started to want to trace that, and that led me to, in terms of the blue whale, it led me down to Grytviken in the Antarctic, where there are these enormous and charismatic and horrifying vast industrial structures in these beautiful pristine landscapes where they boiled up
whales,
whale oil, whale blubber, and so forth. So
and
that was the first trip.
You introduced very usefully the word nostalgia early on, because you think that crucial to our sense of, our use of extinction culturally is nostalgia.
Yeah, I mean, it's speculative, of course, and that's, to a certain extent, that's what I'm allowed to do by being, you know, not being a biologist or so forth. What I began to to speculate on was why nostalgia is so important. We see it as a useless thing to a certain extent. It's certainly something not to be trusted, as deceptive, as sentimental. And I started thinking, well, yes, that is a property of nostalgia, but it's so universal, it's so pervasive. It's not just a recent cultural phenomenon. You find it thousands of years ago. You find it encoded in lots of different languages. It's something very human. And I started to think, well, maybe actually it's quite useful, and we can possibly steer it, use it as a trait that we have. We're not just this awful rapacious species, that perhaps we have a suite of traits that are really positive, and we can, if we get a bit of a handle on them, we can steer them in a really good direction.
What might they be?
What might the suits be? What might the direction be?
What might the useful traits be? Because as we're going to discuss with Matthew White in a little while, I mean, the story is extinction and extinction and extinction. It's not new, this, is it?
No, it isn't. I mean, what I would imagine was useful initially was that it enabled us to not only remember where we'd been, but exploit our environment better. But more importantly, if you look at the fact that we are fundamentally an innovative tool user, and the point in time when we really became modern humans, we were able to go somewhere and carry with us a cultural artifact like a tool, and not only remember how we'd formed it in the first place, even a very different surrounding, but we were able to innovate it. And that was something that previous humans hadn't managed to do, or hominids hadn't managed to do. And I think it's that faculty of being able to remember that has enabled us to advance in our environment so much.
Matthew White, I just want to bring you in at this point, because among all the kind of lists of terrible human atrocities that your book contains, there's some very interesting figures about statistics about the extinction of languages. You talk about, for instance, Native American languages, and you list at one point how quickly they disappear.
Oh, yes.
So I'm just wondering, in terms of this, a bit of statistical backup to what Melanie is talking here.
Well, you need it.
Not that you need it, Melanie, of course.
No, but it is true that there have been... the Western Hemisphere has lost, a huge percentage of its original languages, and Australia as well. Yes.
Right. Well, it's just interesting if you see things like languages and human cultures as analogous to the natural species which are becoming extinct all the time. That does slightly change the way you look at it, because a bleak version of the story might be that natural selection produces an extraordinary variety of beautiful creatures, and the tool-using hominid then stomps around getting rid of them again.
That's quite accurate, isn't it?
Well,
we go in and out of phases. In terms of having a perspective on any of these kinds of things about what's natural and what isn't, and where we stand within that, dialect, languages have gone in and out of diversity through lots of different phases. Certainly when agriculture came and you have lots of migrations going on, you'll get a phase of dialects, languages disappearing, and then diversity will spring up again. That's a natural process for sure. I think what's interesting about this phase, not only are we a very aware society now, but we're also aware that this is happening in orders of magnitude more rapidly than it was doing before. And I think that puts us in a unique position of being able to just guide our future in a different kind of way, and decide whether that's what the kind of animal we want to be at this stage, or whether it isn't.
Well, I think that's interesting that you say animal, because that's the thing that we have to realise, isn't it? That if we really felt keenly the fact that we are part of nature, then we wouldn't screw it up. But I think the thing is that we've kind of put ourselves in a position where we think we're above it, or can control it, or somehow aren't part of it. It's kind of a weird kind of...
I think you could equally argue that our only chance of being useful to it and perhaps saving it in any way is by rising above it, is by displaying a kind of a quality of perhaps mercy that isn't available to your average animal, that is, similar to the idea of nostalgia.
But I mean, science can help here, can't it? I mean, the fact that a philosopher like Peter Singer is so aware that the rest of the apes have consciousness, not like ours, but analogous to ours, that all sorts of other creatures have feelings and so on, that has changed our attitude already, slightly.
Yeah, it does. I mean, if we witness things... I was talking to my husband about this last night, actually. If you are witness to something that appears quite human, or at least appears to be suffering in any way, it's more likely to stay your hand. you know, if you were able to be empathetic with it, for sure. But I mean, I think there's a long history of how, cultural history of how we've got to this stage, and I try to trace that as much as I can. But at the same time, again, when you start looking at timescales, we've gone in and out of phases of being more or less destructive and more or less affected by our natural environment, because some very early phases we pushed animals to extinction.
Got rid of all the trees, killed all the big animals, moved on. Yes.
But in other situations, by living up hard, close against nature, we've developed a culture. There are societies who develop cultures that are able to be more sustainable, more cautious, have taboos in place, and so forth.
Well, let's move on to something that follows directly from this, which is the underlying question of whether we have become more violent, more extreme, more rapacious, more dangerous, more bloody as time has gone on or not. Matthew White, you say you're basically, you just love numbers, you love statistics, and you spent
Yes.
a long time...
It's an odd...
and what you've been doing for a long time is just trying to work out the death toll from various historical events,
Yes.
so that you can rank them. And you call the book that results Atrocitology.
Yes.
Which is, I guess, what it is. Now, some of the statistics in the book won't surprise people. We're very much accustomed to the idea that the 20th century was the most violent in human history, and indeed the Second World War tops your list of most violent events.
Yes.
But there are lots of surprises, aren't there? Just coming further down the list, just tell us a few.
Oh, well, there was the Anlushan Rebellion in China, which... 36 million people disappeared. How many of them were dead is disputable, but
and this was when?
This was in the 700s, in the Tang Dynasty of China. We sometimes forget just how destructive some of these older episodes were.
Genghis Khan is right up there with Stalin.
Genghis Khan is second on the list, tied with Mao Zedong.
Yeah.
With 40 million is my estimate. It varies tens of millions in either direction. The
people in this country will be quite surprised and shocked to see just how high up on the list the number of people dying in famines in British India is as well.
Yes, that's something that's only recently been uncovered and studied, and but yes, it was tens of millions over time, repeated famines.
So, I mean, as we'll come on to in a moment, some of this is quite controversial stuff. How do you do your raw research? Do you separate civilian deaths or military deaths? How do you do it?
I pretty much consider all man-made deaths to be equal. There's arguments that can be made in either direction, but I figure if we did it to ourselves, then that counts. And so I get civilian deaths, military, famine, battle, genocide, all as a single number. Yes.
And of course, I mean, a lot of historians would argue that when you get accounts of how many people died in ancient history or medieval history, you can discount them because nobody knew how to count. You don't think that's true?
Not entirely, no, because they kept tax records, they kept records of all sorts, and money has been a constant throughout human civilization, at least, not necessarily all of human existence. So they kept records of, they had to send soldiers off, they had to feed them, they had to know how many to supply for, and then when they conquered territory, they counted how many people were there so they could tax them to... And if there was a civil war, they'd count again and find there were, millions of people missing.
So I know you don't draw this conclusion yourself, but in terms of the numbers,
yes.
It has been argued that we only see the 20th century as so incredibly violent because there were many, many more of us around to be killed. But if you look at it in proportional terms, it doesn't stand out particularly.
That's true, and I'm not even sure it stands out particularly in pure numbers. Second World War was the deadliest human event in history, and but again, Genghis Khan was second. He was from the 1200s, and
you make the point: 95% of the deaths,
yes.
in the 20th century were from natural causes.
Yes,
more
yes.
than 95%.
Yeah, in spite of, because we focus on the violent events, we forget that there have been a huge number of people in the 20th century, and most have died of natural causes.
Now, you draw some conclusions at the end of this. You're very cautious about the conclusions because this is a book about numbers, really. But one of the conclusions that will surprise people, perhaps, very interesting, is that, in general, chaos is far deadlier than tyranny.
Yes, it's one of what I believe I've discovered with studying this. It's an argument that goes back and forth that I've witnessed, where people feel that a dictatorship is a horrible thing and it should be avoided at all costs, even at the expense of bringing order to the. But I feel that a lot of the numbers seem to indicate that there have been far more deadly events when all civilization collapses.
When law and order breaks down. I mean,
yes.
The most controversial recent example of this would, of course, be Iraq.
Oh, yes.
Where there's an enormous argument still going on about how many Iraqi civilians died after the war.
Right.
Do you have a sort of best guess on that now?
The best guess, I would think, would be about 150,000 have died in the war since Saddam was overthrown. And possibly, again, just a best guess would be maybe 300,000 died under Saddam. So, but that was over a much longer period of time. So there was
a spike in deaths after caused by the vacuum,
the destruction, the breakdown of law and order.
Not nearly as high as some people have said, including.
Yes, there have been estimates in various directions.
And so a note of caution, just as everyone's celebrating in Libya,
yes.
Gaddafi may have been a monstrous dictator. He didn't actually kill that many people himself, so we just have to be a little bit careful before celebrating, hoping that there is not a period of chaos in Libya.
Yes, it's possible. Their numbers are very, very unknown, but yes.
Just before we open this up, one other thing that really struck me, and I think will strike people, is that there are lots of people who haven't gone down as evil dictators, who it turns out killed huge numbers of people and sort of historically got away with it.
Oh yes, Peter the Great is a classic example. He's the Great.
And how many did that Great kill?
It's possible 3 million is one estimate.
Wow.
That's how many taxpayers disappeared between various censuses.
That was in the cause of modernisation, which is another great cause of atrocity. Atrocity. Actually, if you're called the Great,
yes,
according to your book, you've probably killed a staggering number of people. Yeah.
Frederick the Great, of course. Alexander, yes.
Yeah. What do the rest of us make of this?
One of the things...
No, go on, David.
One of the things that I think is really interesting about it is that you are using being retrospective to try and get people to unsentimentalise our perspective on things, to get people to see more clearly about what lies behind us. Do you think that it will have an effect on how people think and then how people act?
I would hope so. There is this sense of we live in the worst times, but a lot of that is that we've forgotten how bad the times were in the past. And it also the sense of understanding how brutal we can be. Despite what you might learn in history books, if you actually just study the brutality of human history, you could... If you recognize it, you can kind of like overcome it. One thing I was noticing, or I wanted to comment earlier on something you were talking about, was there has been this trend of, at the same time that we try to overcome our brutality towards ourselves, it's almost parallel with the overcoming brutality to animals. Animal welfare started showing up in the 1700s about the same time, and the same individuals as trying to abolish the slave trade. So I think there's a parallel in there.
There is. I mean, I agree with you. You find conservation awareness and women's rights, the rights, emancipation of the slave trade and so forth, with a little bit of luxury, actually, to a certain extent, a little bit of space, a more full belly. People are able to start to be more aware of the suffering of other people around them and animals around them. So you get an expansion of the moral consciousness. However, we're also talking about the same period being the period in time where we've had high levels of inequality across the world, which is increasing, and also high levels of destruction of our natural environment of wildlife. So it's not an easy, it's not straight, it's not a complacent picture, is it? But,
No.
Jarvis.
I wonder about whether it's. Would you say it's mobs that do a lot? It seems to me that it's like, we've kind of had a conversation about human nature, haven't we? Quite a lot of it, and hoping maybe that human nature can become better. It seems to get to its worst when you just get a gang. It's just like in those Hammer horror films. They all get the flaming torches. They get the flaming torch, and it's just, and then they just go off and just slaughter loads of people. Do you think there's something in that if you get to a more individual society, somehow people seem to simmer down a bit?
I'm not sure, really. There is sort of this sometimes mass insanity that seems to take over societies, but
it was very easy to get, well, it appears to be relatively easy to get ordinary Germans to go and shoot and kill Jews, ordinary sort of middle-of-the-road Russian officials to go and kill kulaks and peasants in very, very large numbers and very, very brutally. And that happens quite quickly. I mean, moving from being a sort of a guy in a suit in an office to going out and hacking people's heads in can happen pretty fast.
Dostoevsky speaks about that, and he says that all you need to get that to happen is you need the possibility of preferment to be available to the person that's doing it.
As simple as that.
Yeah, that's his argument.
Better pension, a better paycheck.
Yeah.
But also, very often, again, coming back to the book, the promise of a better future. If we only kill these people, paradise is just round the next corner or the next copse.
I was surprised at how many were mistakes or overreactions.
Give us an example of a mistake. To
The obvious one is the First World War. One assassination, and they want to start investigating their leads in another country, and just everybody starts overreacting. Yes.
Think twice, and don't be too pleased about what you've just written. Those are the two lessons of today. Thank you to all my guests. Mother, Brother, Lover by Jarvis Cocker. Matthew White's Atrocitology and On Extinction by Melanie Challenger are all out now, and Jez Butterworth's Jerusalem is on in London until January the 14th, though you may have to beg to get a ticket. You can always read the book. It's now published as a book as well. Next week we're going to be in Perth in Australia along with the Queen and the heads of the Commonwealth, and we'll be talking about Australia, the lucky country, mining, money, and of course the monarchy as well. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Thank you for listening to this Radio 4 podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you might like to try others like it, such as In Our Time or Thinking Aloud, both of which are also available from the Radio 4 website. And the mischances and the surprises and so on.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because your songs are very specific, but they've worked because people, even if they didn't go to St Martin's College and study sculpture, or even if the girlfriend didn't have wood chip on the wall at her home, they seem to be something that people plug into and said, yes, I had an experience just like that, or that reminds me of so-and-so.
Well, I hope so. I think the thing is, people always overlook the material that they should be writing about because it's right under the noses, so I suppose they don't see it, It's too obvious to them. Or they think, nobody's going to be interested in that. Everybody knows that. But that's the big mistake, and that's what I'm here today to make sure nobody makes this mistake. No, because it's like that's your material. That's what you should write about. But there's a trouble, with lots of art.
While walking down Oxford Street has been popped into his trouser pocket, and the giant has now made off with Mr. Butterworth. If he drops him out, we will have him on the show very shortly. But we're going to start with Jarvis Cocker, bard of Sheffield, whose songs for Pulp and in his solo career, Sardonic Suite, have resonated for decades. Jarvis, the lyrics are now published by Faber as if they were poems, as it were, in a book.
No, you mustn't say that.
Well, they sort of look like poems. You open this book up, and it's called Mother, Brother, Lover.
Yeah, even that rhymes.
And even that rhymes. It's your favourite rhyme, I think you say, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And they look like poems, but you make the point at the beginning that it's very, very important not to confuse a lyric with a poem.
Yeah, otherwise you will be prosecuted. Because these words all came about because I'd written some songs, or I'd written songs as a member of a band, and once you've got a song, it's not really a song until somebody's put the words on.
Listening to.
Yeah, well, I suppose that's if I've got any originality, which we can discuss if we want in a bit, but that's where it is, because I was a fan of pop music. I've been brought up with pop music. Pop music was central to being a kid, you know, when I was a kid. People did watch Top of the Pops, people discussed the bands that they liked, they rooted for the bands who were going up the charts and stuff like that. So I was into all that culture of it, but then for some reason I wanted it to tell me something a bit more than just like, "Ooh, love you, baby, I think you're really good," whatever. So I wanted to put some what I really thought about relationships, because I thought when I first kissed a girl, it wasn't anything like it had been in songs. It was a cataclysm. Well, it weren't. It was all right actually, but it was different to how I. So I thought, well,
so you've got all the fumbling. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. The papers have been full of debate about the consequences for our human future of the Earth's hugely swelling population. Will it bring yet more extinctions and yet more extreme violence? We will get some historical perspective today with the writer Melanie Challenger, whose poetic meditation about us, other species and dying cultures is called On Extinction, and with the statistically inebriated Matthew White, whose handbook to the most deadly events through history is full of surprises. But we're going to start nearer to home, talking about more fantastical, nostalgic and sometimes violent traits in Englishness. We hope to be joined by the playwright Jez Butterworth, whose Jerusalem is the most lauded new play for years. Unfortunately, he met a 40-foot-high giant.
I was a singer in that band, so that was my job.
You're the singer, you write the words.
Yeah, which at first, when I realised that I'd wanted to be lots of kids want to be in bands, don't they? You know, it's like a fantasy, like I want to be an ambulance driver or a fireman, spaceman. I want to be a singer, pop star, show off, get lots of girls, etc. But then you realise you actually have to do some work, and I was going to have to write the words to the songs, and so then you've got that horrible thing of what am I going to write about?
And a lot of your songs are stories; they're small narratives, which are about your early life in Sheffield, being an adolescent, trying to pick up girls and so on.
Yeah,
and
nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed.
No.
And you say that you were looking as a kid for songs which were more about your real experience rather than sort of glossy, overwritten songs, perhaps that you've been